Here we go. And take it away.
All right, everybody. So thank you so much for being here with me this morning. And thanks so much to everyone who's been working so hard to make this conference be as enjoyable as it has been. So as Colleen said, my name is Bailey McNichol. I'm a PhD student in forest ecology in the School of Biological Sciences at UNL. And today I'm going to be sharing with you some of my dissertation research, which is broadly focused on understanding how environmental gradients influence present and future forest composition in the Niobrara River Valley. So as we know, environmental stressors such as wildfires, drought events, and outbreaks of native and invasive pests have strong influences on forest diversity and functioning globally. And these stressors can have consequences not only for biodiversity loss, but in addition can reduce the ability of forests to provision important ecosystem services, such as providing wildlife, habitat, and food, as well as regulating climate, both at local and global scales. And particularly, the effects of these stressors tend to be strongest along ecotones, or the boundaries between two ecosystems. And this is really important in the context of Nebraska, because forests in Nebraska really are restricted to narrow regions. So throughout the state, limitations in precipitation are kind of the primary reason why most of our state is comprised with forests, rather with prairie and cropland instead of forests. And so water availability is really important in structuring where forests actually occur. And because of this, they're kind of restricted to narrow ranges in elevational depressions or along floodplains and streams. And this makes them highly susceptible to different environmental stressors. Because if the environment in these areas becomes unfavorable to their growth, they can't really expand too far outside of the area where they can access that water resource. And so what we see as a result in forests throughout Nebraska are these strong environmental gradients as we transition to areas with higher to lower water availability that kind of cause this gradual transition from forest to the surrounding prairie. And so in order to understand sort of the dynamics of forests in these boundary locations near water, we established two long-term forest monitoring plots in the state of Nebraska. And these are through the Forest Geo Network, which is the Forest Global Earth Observatory. This is run through the Smithsonian. And here I'm just showing where our plots are located. So first, we see a map of tree cover in North America, and we see this really rapid transition from lots of forest in the eastern half of the US to predominantly prairie in the Midwest. And so our plots, first is the Niobrara plot, which is located in the middle Niobrara Valley in north central Nebraska. And our other plot is located at Indian Cave State Park in the southeast corner of the state. And these were established in collaboration with the Nature Conservancy and Nebraska Game and Parks. Most of my research is focused on the Niobrara plot, so that's primarily what I'll be talking with you about today. So many of you, I'm sure, have either done management or spent time in the Niobrara River Valley. And this area really is a biogeographic crossroads. And what I mean by this is that we see the confluence of species such as paper birch from boreal ecosystems to the north, black walnut from eastern deciduous forest to the east, and ponderosa pine, which is a primary component of western coniferous forests, all converging in one place. And so we get this really interesting mixture of biomes, which occurs not only in the plant communities, but also with a wide variety of wildlife species. And so what happens is that we have a lot of species that are at the extremes of their geographic ranges and the extremes of the conditions that they can tolerate for growth and survival. And specifically, the Niobrara plot is on one of the designated biologically unique landscapes here in the middle Niobrara Valley. And while we have a variety of the terrestrial communities that have been identified by the Nebraska Natural Legacy Project, particularly four that we have that are considered at risk are the dry upland bur oak woodland, paper birch spring branch canyon forest, basswood ironwood spring branch canyon forests, and then the dry ponderosa pine open woodland and savanna. And so this plot, actually, as well as our Indian cave plot, are both situated in these biologically unique landscapes. And this is really neat because what it allows for is long-term monitoring of the status of these forests, so how they're changing through time, sort of their health and different stressors that might be affecting those at-risk species and communities. And we can then relate what we find back to, well, how do we conserve this biodiversity and ensure that these species continue to exist in these ecosystems over the long term? Some more information about the plot itself. So again, it's on the Nature Conservancy's Niobrara Valley Preserve to the south of the Niobrara River, and it's 560 by 360 meters. So kind of to orient you here, the river is just here to the north. This is the extent of the plot, this rectangle, and each of these small squares are a 20 by 20 meter quadrat. And how these plots are established is that every woody stem, so every tree, shrub, or vine that is a centimeter or greater in trunk diameter is identified to species, it's given a tag to allow for long-term monitoring, it's measured for diameter, and then it's mapped. So all of these pink dots represent one of those stems, and so we know the location and a lot of information about almost 8,300 woody stems, which are representing 27 different woody species. And the topography of this area, if anyone's been up there, can attest to this, is really unique. So these sort of offshoots where you see a lot of trees in these two lines represent spring branch canyons. And trees in these canyons are fed by groundwater springs and seeps, which kind of create this locally very wet, cool environment that's more hospitable to tree growth in the surrounding prairie. And we really do see distinct environmental gradients as we move from the floodplain up to the prairie, where those canyon bottoms, again, are very wet. As we transition into upland forest, it's more open, it's a higher light environment. And then when we get to the ecotone, where the forest meets the prairie, we sort of have this high exposure condition as we transition to the surrounding herbaceous community. And so we kind of wanted to actually go through and quantify, well, how, anecdotally walking around these forests, we can see these dramatic changes in composition, but how do these environmental gradients influence forest structure and diversity? So to answer this question, we used aerially derived LiDAR data to develop what's called a digital elevation model, which I have pictured here. And so basically, again, this is the plot. It's just flipped. So the river is down here. The surrounding Sandhills Prairie is up here. And you can see that we think of Nebraska often as being fairly flat, but there's actually pretty dramatic topography in our plot along this 74-meter elevational gradient from the floodplain to the prairie. And it's really important in kind of structuring where these trees are occurring. So we use this digital elevation model, and for each 20 by 20 meter quadrat, we extracted the cumulative annual solar radiation, which I have a map of radiation here. You can see this red is kind of a high light intensity area. This blue is kind of the cooler canyons. So this solar radiation represents light intensity, but also exposure. And we also extracted the elevation, slope, and the aspect, so how the land is oriented for each of those quadrats. And we use those continuous environmental variables to develop 5 different habitat types that kind of capture the variation in these different variables. So I have a map of the plot shown here, where each quadrat is color-coded based on its habitat. So you can see the canyon bottom, sort of along the bottom of that canyon, shockingly. The upper canyon slopes here. All of this kind of middle green represents upland forest. And then we have the floodplain down here by the river, again, that high light, but also high water environment. And then we have ecotone here, which is a highlight environment, but the lowest water availability. And for each of these individual quadrats, using the forest data, we calculated stem density, which is just the total number of stems, total basal area, which accounts for not only how many stems there are, but the sizes of trees. So we can think of this kind of as a proxy for forest biomass. And then we also calculated species richness, just the total number of species. And generally, what we see is that forest structure tends to be more complex in these lower light, mid-elevation habitats. And so what I mean by forest structure is not only the number of stems, but the size of the trees. And these patterns, if we think about, what trees need for growth, these patterns kind of match our expectations, right? In general, we know that trees need lots of water to grow. They need access to nutrients from the soil. And so generally, we would expect that there's more growth in those environments that are favorable for trees and less growth occurring sort of along the ecotone where we transition to an environment that's very challenging for a lot of species to grow. And we see a similar habitat, or rather a similar trend if we look at species richness. So again, we see the highest richness occurring in those canyon bottoms and upland forest, and we see a gradual decrease as sort of the environmental gradient changes and conditions become more stressful for trees to grow. And really, missed a slide, sorry. And really, so the digital elevation model from that aerial data gives us somewhat of a sense of environmental conditions, but we actually wanted to quantify these, the differences in these microhabitats on the ground. So throughout this past growing season in 2021, we monitored conditions including light availability, relative humidity, air temperature, and soil temperature, as well as soil moisture. And I just kind of wanted to show some of these results to really hit home the point that light and water availability matter for these species. So here we're seeing what's called the maximum photosynthetically active radiation. You can pretty much think of this as the maximum light availability during that month. And what we see is that, in fact, we do have the highest light environment along the floodplain and prairie ecotones shown here, and we have gradual decreases in light availability for trees as we enter those canyons in the upland forest. So we have the highest light in the floodplain and prairie ecotone, and we also then collected this data to kind of validate what we assume about water availability, that it's decreasing as we increase in elevation. And so here you can see that across the growing season, so from June to October, and this monitoring is continuing, that in general, we have a trend where water availability or soil moisture, which is on this y-axis, decreases with elevation. And what's interesting here to sort of draw to your attention is that we can see at these lowest elevations, we can have quite a bit of variation in water availability. So if you've been along the floodplain of the Niobrara River, you can imagine some areas, there's sort of standing water, they're almost always moist, whereas other areas with a lot of high light and more well-drained soils tend to be drier. So we can have this variation in soil moisture at the lowest elevations, but as we increase in elevation, we only can see this sort of low soil moisture. So thinking about the really well-drained sandy soils that we see in the sandhills, right? That's not really able to hold water. And so this kind of lends some more insight onto why we see less tree growth as we sort of go along that gradient. And really, topography is incredibly important in driving these species distributions. Is kind of what this tells us. So I just wanted to sort of show a snapshot of a few species and sort of the habitats that they prefer. So this is a topographic map. So each of these black lines represents a 5-meter increase in elevation. Again, the floodplain would be down here. Here are two of our main canyons corresponding with these canyons here. And what we see is some habitat specialization occurring. So ponderosa pine is really restricted along these prairie forest ecotones. It doesn't really venture down into the canyons. It likes that highlight environment, and it deals well with well-drained soils. Whereas bur oak, Quercus macrocarpa, it really grows anywhere that it can find enough access to light. So it loves the highlight environments along the floodplain. It does well in the ecotone, and it does well on the upper slopes of the upland forest as well. Conversely, we have ironwood, Astraea virginiana, and we see that it's really highly restricted to the canyon bottoms and to the mid-story of the upland forest. So it's a slower growing species, it's fairly shade tolerant, but it really needs that access to water or it becomes too stressful for this species to grow. And to give you a sense of how sort of other species throughout the plot are driving these trends, we really do see strong preferences for habitats across these species. So another way of thinking about this, these are box plots where each bar represents a species. And in this case, they're ordered by their median solar radiation, with species at this end preferring less light availability and species at this end, which are very light demanding. And so what we see here, right, is a lot of these species in the middle of the figure kind of do well all between the canyon bottoms and into the upland forest, but we have high habitat specialization. For example, these are our 3 willow species and cottonwood. They only occur in those super high light environments, but if we look at this from the perspective of the elevational gradient, they're really restricted to the lowest elevations, right? We don't really ever see those species venturing outside of the floodplain because there's too much competition and it becomes too challenging for them to grow. Similarly, if we look at the high end of the elevational gradient, we see kind of what we would expect, right? Eastern red cedar along the ecotone and encroaching its way into the prairie, and ponderosa pine and smooth sumac. So what this suggests is that these environmental gradients are really important in defining the habitats for these species. And if we see changes in the future, we might see shifts in where they're occurring. So this gives us a really good perspective on what's going on in the forest currently. But we wanted to then ask the question, how do abundances and patterns of woody seedling recruitment compare to the distributions of larger individuals? And so to gain insight on this, we needed to do a census of the seedling community. So remember, the plot only includes individuals that are a centimeter or greater in diameter. And so we really need to sort of look at what's going on with seedlings. Where are they establishing and how are they growing to gain insight on the future forest composition? And so to do this, within each of those 20 by 20 meter quadrats, we established a 1 by 1 meter subplot using this herbaceous sampler, and we census seedlings, including taking information on the species identity, the diameter of the individual, its height, condition notes, right, whether it was affected by herbivory or some other visible stressor, and then we tagged each individual to allow for long-term monitoring. And I really want to emphasize here that the dynamics in seedlings are different from the rest of the forest, right? It takes lots and lots of seedlings, it takes lots of seeds from an adult tree to produce seedlings. And then many, many, many seedlings will actually die before they recruit into a stage where they're more likely to survive. So we expect lots of mortality at this stage, and we hope to continue these censuses in future years to kind of understand those dynamics. I also want to really underscore here that management is going to have important effects on seedling recruitment. So there was a prescribed burn applied in the Niobrara plot in fall 2020, kind of reintroducing fire into this area. In an ideal scenario, we would have been able to do a pre-burn and then a post-burn census of the seedlings to kind of understand the effects of prescribed burns on seedling regeneration. However, as many of you as resource managers know, we sort of need to seize opportunities when they come, and sometimes we just need to do things when the timing is right. So unfortunately, we don't have that data. So what I'm presenting to you, I just want to present with the caveat that we don't know a lot about what these dynamics looked like prior to the burn. And again, a single year of data gives us a snapshot in time. So it's really informative, but we need additional years of data to kind of better understand these patterns. So what I want to show you are some sort of changes in relative species abundances across size classes. And I say relative abundances because keep in mind, for the adults and saplings, which are adults are greater than 5 centimeters and saplings are between 1 to 5 centimeters, we have data across the entire 560 by 360 meter plot. The seedlings, however, we only have data in a 1 by 1 meter quadrat in each of those plots because it would be extremely resource and time intensive to census every single seedling. So to kind of make this a little bit easier to interpret than these histograms, I'm going to show you this data in terms of rank abundances. And so what these following figures are going to do, basically for each size class, I gave each species a rank. So the most abundant species gets a 1. Thanks. The next most abundant gets a 2, and so on. And we do the same thing for other size classes. And what this allows us to do is compare the relative abundances to species. So I'm just going to be showing correlations between these. This 1-to-1 line would mean that they're equally abundant in the adult size class and the sapling size class. If they fall above this line, for this example, it would mean that there is a relatively higher abundance of adults. If they fall below this line, it would mean that there's a relatively higher abundance of saplings. And I'm just going to present some results for a few species of interest and concern to kind of give you a snapshot of what we found. So first, perhaps quite encouragingly, we saw lower seedling recruitment of eastern red cedar. So here, if we look at the adult versus sapling abundances, we see that it is the most abundant adult and the most abundant sapling species throughout our forest monitoring plot. However, if we look at this in terms of saplings versus seedlings, we see that there's a relatively higher abundance of saplings than there are seedlings. And we see that there are also significantly more adults than there are seedlings. And so this is encouraging, and there could be a couple of mechanisms going on here. First, hopefully the prescribed burn actually led to some mortality of eastern red cedar seedlings. This is what we're really hoping. However, we don't have dynamic or multi-year data on this species strategy. So as we know with eastern red cedar, once it reaches a certain size class, it becomes very challenging to control and get rid of. So it could just be that a lot of individuals have reached those side classes, and so we see high mortality at the seedling stage because there are lots of already well-established individuals throughout the plot. This also could be an artifact of prior management. So right before we established the forest geoplot, there was some thinning of eastern red cedar, and it could be that some of the areas that we sampled were kind of seeing the effects of that thinning. It could also just be due to other environmental factors. Many of you, I'm sure, if you've walked through a stand of eastern red cedar, this sort of forest floor looks familiar. We see that not a lot really grows in areas with eastern red cedar, which is kind of interesting. Then if we take a look at smooth sumac, here I'm just showing one of these figures because sumac doesn't reach greater than 5 centimeters in diameter generally. So based on this ranking, it falls just into the sapling class, although this also encompasses adults. And we see in this case that there's a much larger relative abundance of seedlings as compared to saplings. So we see here it's sort of the fourth most prominent for saplings, but there's a really high abundance for seedlings. And this is kind of interesting. So I think there's a couple of things going on. I think first, it's important to keep in mind that this species is disturbance adapted and it deals with stress quite well. Part of its strategy is that it's clonal, so the root networks of smooth sumacs are all connected underground. So after an event like a prescribed burn or a stressful time, it can rapidly resprout. So it sends up more shoots that following growing season to kind of recover the growth that it's lost above ground. However, this raises an interesting question about the effects of management strategies on different species, right? We know that prescribed fire is a critical tool to use to reduce woody encroachment of eastern red cedar, but we have to be careful sort of about the consequences that this may be affecting in other species. For example, smooth sumac could become a strong woody encroacher if it's not treated several years in a row. So just good things to keep in mind so that we don't have lots and lots of mini sumac forests kind of taking over the prairie. And then just to touch on some species that we're seeing lower recruitment of throughout the plot. In general, bur oak, so we see a really high relative abundance of adults, less saplings, and even fewer seedlings. And we see a similar pattern if we look at ponderosa pine, where we see this kind of decrease across size classes as we approach the seedling class, and also for paper birch. And it's important here, there's a lot of dynamics going on, and so we have to be careful about we don't have a great understanding of exactly why this is occurring. There are a couple kind of hypotheses from this single year of data. So part of this has to do with the species strategy. So bur oaks, if you think about their sort of seeding process, right? They produce acorns every 2 to 3 years, and one seed for a bur oak has a ton of resources in it. So it's much more costly to produce as compared to, say, a ponderosa pine or a paper birch seed, which is much smaller, and there's a much larger number of seeds produced per given adult. So, seed size might have something to do with this species strategy as well. So it's not necessarily bad news that we're not seeing a lot of oak seedlings. We kind of need additional years of data to understand this. But sort of what this all amounts to is that these sort of reductions in ponderosa pine and paper birch populations we're seeing suggest that perhaps that species that are kind of at the extremes of their geographic ranges might be most at risk of local extirpation, right? It should be somewhat alarming that we're only seeing a few seedlings of these really important forest components. And so future kind of monitoring and management outlooks, to gain more insight here, we really need to recensus the seedling subplots. And the nice thing about this infrastructure is we should be able to do this on an annual basis. And that'll help us to kind of understand the growth and mortality of individuals, right? So not only a snapshot of where they established this year, but where are these seedlings actually surviving over time and continuing to grow? And this will help us to partition out the relative effects of environment on seedling recruitment from the effects of management, and understand sort of how can we time these different management techniques like thinning and burns to sort of maximize biodiversity conservation, as well as important control of woody encroachers and other problem species. And this will eventually give us insight into which species are vulnerable and likely to disappear from these forests in the future. So just a brief recap. First, we see that topography is a key driver of composition in the Niobrara forests. And from this, we can say that future changes in environmental conditions along these gradients might have a lot of consequences for forest diversity, including favoring those stress-tolerant species that are able to adapt quickly to change, perhaps accelerating shifts of the ecotone, right? In some areas, we might see woody encroachment as trees move into the prairie. However, if there are large drought events or heat stress events, we might see mortality. We might see a retraction in that forest, promoting, more herbaceous diversity. We don't know. We need to continue collecting data to sort of have that information. And ultimately, long-term monitoring of growth, survival, and recruitment of these species is really important if we are to understand sort of how to conserve these at-risk terrestrial communities and how to manage them for favorable outcomes for all of these species. I have lots of people to acknowledge. So our field crew has been spectacular in sort of allowing these data collection efforts to occur. Lots of different funding sources, collaborators in the School of Natural Resources who helped develop that digital elevation model, my dissertation committee, and lots of key collaborators at the Nature Conservancy and Nebraska Game and Parks. And finally, I just want to say that we are totally open to and welcome the prospect of collaborative studies and data collection efforts in our plots. They provide really great infrastructure for asking all kinds of interesting questions. And so please reach out to myself or my advisor, Sabrina Russo, if you're interested in these options. And with that, I'd be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you so much.